everybody, and welcome to day 2 of our second edition of the People Analytics Global Summit. It's always a joy and a privilege to witness conversations from a front row seat as a co-facilitator. We have Barbara with us today, taking good care of us backstage and keeping us honest with all things technology and logistics. And we have an absolutely amazing lineup of speakers. This conversation, we are kicking it off in force. We will talk about staying ahead of the curve and how can we use data and people analytics for change management and business agility. I do want to wholeheartedly welcome everybody in the audience, and I hope you are enjoying a great, whatever moment of the day you are experiencing on your time zones, either now live or later on as you will enjoy the recording. Barbara, let's make the best out of our very short time today. Please help me bring up the wonderful people on the screen. And as we will see them coming up, just a reminder and a warm encouragement to everybody in the audience. Please use the comments, please use the chat as your own conversation space. Consider that all questions that we are raising in our panel conversation are also open to you. Drop us your thoughts, your opinions. If you have amazing resources that you can drop a link for, please do that in the chat. It's always great to help our community out with insights and energy and motivation. So I will start with welcoming our panelists. And thank you so very much for taking the time and the energy to be here today. And this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart as a change enthusiast. I only say that I'm a change manager as a secondary packaging of my professional love. And it's very easy, the first round. I will just ask you to shortly introduce yourselves, and then change management and business agility. These are labels that are out there and everybody infuses them with their own expectations and their own understandings and whatever it is that they have experienced on their personal and professional path. So a short introduction, and then for the outline of our conversation today, what is the meaning of change management and business agility that you bring into our time together? And I love one extra challenge when we have two wonderful Heathers with us. So we will go with Heather McBee, and then we will move to Double H. Welcome, Heather. Good to see you.
Thank you so much. Great to be here. The question that you posed on what are we talking about? Why are we talking about data with change management, with business agility? And the way I really sum this up is that our best way to help the business consume the information is to take models of change management and quantify them. So for instance, if we think there could be a 20% dip because of the J curve of change and then it'll shoot up afterwards, we got to quantify that to them so that they understand, hey, when we launch this change for 2 weeks, you're going to see your numbers. If it's a call center, they take 40 calls, first time resolution, it's going to dip 20% for 2 weeks. And that's okay. Doesn't mean that the change is not working. It just means it's following the model. And then in 2 weeks, it'll probably go back up to where you were at, and then it'll accelerate from there. So to me, that's like the core of the more we can use data to make it consumable for the business, so they don't have to look at it as these are just models or fluffy stuff. They can actually absorb it.
Thank you. And I will just take you one step back. Please just tell us a little bit about yourself. And clarifying, my question was around what do we mean by change management and business agility before we dive into how we use data for this. I'm fully aware of the fact that some people come into this thinking change management ITIL style. Some people come here thinking change management, organizational and people side. So that that would help us set the scene for moving forward?
All right, I'll start. I'll reverse. So
We go agile.
I'll be agile and show you change. So I'm a global head of people at Shift Moving. We're a marketplace for relocation management. And so it's a VC-backed startup. Everything we do is about speed. So the agility is inherent. It's our only advantage as a startup. And so that's why change management's core to everything we are doing. And our mission is changing the way the world moves. So it's everything that we do, it's in our DNA to be part of that change, agile, and then obviously using data for that.
Thank you so very much. Heather Holland, Double H, good to have you with us today. Welcome.
Awesome. Thank you. Good to be here. I'm Heather Holland, Chief People, Talent, and Diversity Curator at the Holland Collective, LLC. The Holland Collective is, it curates custom consulting and advisory experiences for whether that be executive, senior leadership, mid-sized businesses in the space of human resources or people, leadership, diversity, inclusion, and talent. So thank you for having me. What is change management and what is agility? I think of change management in a broad scope is that it's a business process, and how does the business and how do we support the business from a people's perspective with data and analytics to make a shift, whether that's a shift in culture, a shift in business processes because of internal or external factors, and the ability to be agile or flexible and move with the direction, especially those unexpected directions. We talk about COVID and the nature of, return to work, whether hybrid or remote, are big things in a business's ability to be agile and manage that change. Are one big example right there.
Thank you so much. And our third People Analytics Musketeer for today, Eli Hernandez, good to have you.
Thank you so much. Just Eli with one H, so only one H on this side, not too confusing, hopefully. But I am the Director of People for Purdy Group USA. We are a automotive group with Toyota operations in the state of Texas. Specifically talking about change management and business agility. So change management for me really is a planned intervention of moving from one state to a desired state. And then business agility then comes into play when we're talking about how we get there, right? So the change management piece is we understand we're in a current state model and would like to be here. Agility is using and consuming the information that we have available to us to get there in a way that reduces waste, and make sure that everybody is along for the ride and that the change is successful.
Thank you so very much for being here. And I would invite everybody in the audience, as we move through our conversation, please keep on dropping your own understanding and expectation from change management and business agility. And I am sure we all keep an eye on your comments, and that would help us continuously shape and nuance our panel conversation. So everybody talks about change all the time. We even talk about how change itself is changing, whether we talk about change at the world level, industry level, organization level, even individual level. So yesterday, someone mentioned, is anyone else feeling overwhelmed by data and people analytics? And, before going into paralysis by analysis, how do you make sense of everything that is available? And I would really want to bring this question into our conversation. And I would ask Double H to be our pioneer for this round.
Happy to kick it off, Manola. How do you make sense of the data without sort of that initial level of overwhelming. I think the taking that first glance at it and looking at it as a story. What's that big picture story? Kind of these are the key 5 elements when it relates to the organization, the culture, the people, where we're located. And then it's like starting with a vision in mind, and then where do you want to be, and then starting with the high level vision, and then you break it down from there.
Well, Heather McBee and Eli, the unmuting competition is open. Heather.
I'll build on Double H in that the key thing that I start to do is look at what's the business strategy, and then what are some things that I think might be helpful to that business strategy. And so trying to narrow focus on maybe it's not all the tools in the toolkit of HR and all the data we have. Maybe there's just a couple. And if it's important to the business, I can start selling these couple instead of trying to overpower myself and the business with all the cool things that we're monitoring at all times. Get them focused on just the vital few.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think that starting with the business objective in mind, right? So every change management initiative, like I said earlier, there's a desired state. So understanding what that desired state is, what the objectives are to accomplish that, and then defining what metrics or pieces of analytics can help support that. I think that in HR, there are a ton of different metrics and analytics you can use for different reasons or different use cases. You may not need all of them at a given time, right? So like Heather McBee said, kind of identifying what those key pieces are for that particular initiative, and then understanding that those are going to be what you use as your gauge for moving forward in the process.
May I just invite you to take this conversation a little bit deeper and make it practical with some use cases? If you can think of, this is the situation, and these are the data points, or these are the kind of people analytics avenues I would start to explore. And Heather McBee.
Sure. So we had a situation where it's really important for us to have the right customer funnel. So marketing's hugely important. How we acquire customers, the lifetime value is a key measure for the business. And they needed to help understanding, you can't be something on the outside that you might not be on the inside. So how could I relate that for them of what turnover might be doing for customer acquisition and lifetime value? So if I came to them with turnover, they'd say, yeah. We know we need to focus on retention. I came to them with, here's our talent acquisition cost against our lifetime value, and that's our average tenure of employees. All of a sudden, poof, they got it. Because it related so applicably to what they were trying to drive. And so then it's like, okay, let's focus on maybe some retention strategies that we can do that will help support the change effort that you're trying to drive. So it's a lot of marketing mixed in with some data, and then and then influencing the business to see how important that is.
I love the point that you made there with putting business language subtitles to people analytics insights. Eli, I saw you unmuted.
Yeah, I wanted to actually just piggyback off of that idea, talking about what I would call translation, right? Translating from maybe HR or people speak to the business language. There are organizations and people on this call that likely operate in an international capacity, right? And there are maybe cultural customs or the way language is used that there may be some differences there. But at the end of the day, there's a universal language of business. And I think if we learn how to speak the language of business to support the operations team or the overall organization, we do ourselves a really big service, we as in people operations, because it's hard for, I think, us to think naturally in those terms. Our maybe natural inclination is to think about, supporting people, making sure that people are, well prepared to do their job. They feel they're working and operating in an inclusive environment. But at the end of the day, most organizations are there to either generate a profit or accomplish some sort of social mission. And in order to do that, you have to allocate those resources responsibly. And that's when we start using that universal language of business, right?
Double H.
Had to find the unmute button. I think a similar example, but it's still using the concept of the starting point is using the business language and identifying, overlaying the people, data and analytics over the business solutions, the business, which respective part of business that you're in. And if you align with a particular part of business, whether it's engineering, operations, marketing, here's your data. Here's what it looks like. And it satisfies that what's in it for me. That's the information environment they're most familiar with. And that's a great starting point. And you can build from there, and using that internal data, bring in some external data, whether it's from peers or competitors, or where's the market going looking forward? What's in the end state? Where do we want to be?
You made me curious listening to your answers. You made me curious about this bridge between people analytics and business. And I would be curious to hear your thoughts. What are some of the skills that people, on one hand within the HR, but on the other hand within the business, they need to build in order to make the most out of people analytics? Oftentimes we keep this conversation lopsided, that it's the HR that must, rise to this set of skills. But I also believe that there is a huge opportunity for the business to better understand people data and people analytics. So what are the skills and extra points for skills that would not necessarily, are amongst the usual suspects? So maybe even a skill underdog. And Eli, please be our pioneer on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a great question. And if I had a precise answer for you, I would be a very rich man. But to get business and operations leaders to understand the language of people is something that I think we all strive for every day, right? Through our daily coachings with leaders, through different interventions we may have throughout the life cycle of employees. I think really if there are some basic or core takeaways, understanding that the lifetime value of an employee, like Heather McBee said earlier, I think is a huge one. Because so often I think we get lost in, well, if someone is not working out, everyone is easily replaceable. We can just bring the next person in and hope they're the right fit. But there are dollars and cents attached to that. And throughout any process on the people analytics side, there's a cost associated with every decision we take, or every decision we choose not to take. So I think by speaking in, the money of language, language of business, however we choose to define it, one, helps us kind of establish our credibility as a business partner. But I think two, on the operations side, understanding their role, very critical role that they play in ensuring that the workplace is one where people want to be in, where they enjoy coming to work and can really go above and beyond to establish whatever the goals are of the organization. So I would say, understanding what it costs for an employee as far as them starting with the company all the way through the very end, working in averages, just like the world works. I think that's a great place to start, because then you can very clearly in black and white say the decisions we make have a very real impact on the bottom line of the company. And here's the role you play in making sure that we're being good stewards of the resources of the organization.
I'll jump in and add to Eli. A couple of skills that I think are valuable and that have been successful for me are one, business acumen. Learn the business. How does the business make money? Where are their challenges? Where are their pain points? What part of the business makes the most money? What parts make the least? Align yourself and find advocates with those parts of the business, depending on what you need to do. What's their budget? Do you understand their budget? And can you translate that back to them and say, okay, here's your budget. Here's how we sort of break down financial or people costs, the sort of soft, fluffy things, as I once heard. How do you break that or quantify that and then translate that back into that part of the business? And I think that if you can acquire some of those skills, can take practice, get out and see the business and talk to people, and that helps you learn. That definitely helped me learn the business a lot quicker. It's a skill I still use today.
Mm.
And I'll chime in on that is that a lot of they have the skills. Every department's using data. It's meeting them where they are and how they're using their data. And then if we name it, make it consumable, I'll use this example of that I've faced in pretty much every company I've worked for. Finance comes to the table with their headcount waterfall and the cost waterfall. And then I come back with here's my belly button count. And the costs never, like my costs are always different from finance. And in the interesting part is a lot of times finance will put in hedge for turnover. So in their eyes, if I'm reducing turnover, I'm impacting their financials because they're counting on jobs being open for a certain amount of time. If my days open, if suddenly we're way more efficient in getting people into the door, they're like going, hey, you're screwing up the financials. And so if I'm not working with them, so that what I'm trying to impact or what HR is trying to impact also bleeds into the business, we're going to continue to say, oh, my data is the right data. No, it's both the right data. How do we help impact that together? And so a lot of times it's just educating the financial impact or whatever impact that I'm about to have with my change that's going to have downstream impacts. It's like, how can I help see around the corner for the other function before they even know they need to look at that?
Now, as a journalist by trade and a change practitioner by choice, I have come to live by the power of questions, even more so than by the power of answers. And I was wondering, do you have a few signature questions that you ask when you join into change management and business agility conversations? Some questions that really help you unlock very meaningful conversations. And let's see who has trained their fingers best. Eli.
I have fast fingers. Manola, you are speaking my language as someone who loves organization development, right? So change management, OD, all kind of live in the same house, I would say. So thinking about that and dialogic interventions, right, or dialogic conversations to get people thinking about ideal states. There's an appreciative inquiry model, the 4D model, right? And using one of those Ds, the dream, is really how I love to get conversation started in that context, right? If you could dream up the perfect world, the best case scenario, what does that look like? Because oftentimes it's not so unrealistic, right? You can get there with some hard work, some planning, some incremental change. But starting with thinking about questions specifically, I love to say, if you were to dream of the ideal situation, right? Have people write it down independently and then kind of go around the room. You'll likely see there's a lot of overlap. And there might be some differences too, where other people did not think of that, and then it becomes part of the overall roadmap for where you would like to be. So using just kind of that dream concept from the 4D model is something that I think is a great starting point for change management initiatives.
Thank you.
I'll pony back on Eli's and the dream. One of the key things I like to ask is, what would this accomplishment look like on a resume when it's done?
Mm.
It makes it personal instead of it making it business. Oh, we're going to save this amount of money or we're going to do that. It's like, how would you personally articulate this as a resume accomplishment? Then I've got their buy-in on it's personal to them. Then you can start to get some KPIs around it. Then you can make it, more applicable from a what's in it for the company and things like that. Because they at the end of the day, what's in it for them becomes what's in it for the company. But you start with the person first. And what's their biggest fear? What do they think might happen? Like, what measure are they going to be most worried about? What mitigation plan are they thinking about for that? Or what would they like me to do to help impact maybe some of those fears? So those are the questions that I would tackle on. And it's all about the dream still. So what's the dream? What's the nightmare? And how can we help you with those?
And I'll chime in. I love where this has started, Eli, with the dream. That was one of the dream or the vision. And I liked how Heather McBee characterized the dream and nightmare. What's the ideal state? What's the current state versus the ideal state? I will also, to piggyback onto that, add why. What do you want to accomplish? What do you want this to feel like? I'm uber sensitive to culture and how the change impacts the organization and culture. So what do you want people to say about you and the change once the change is done? And that's a little bit more detail about what do you want it to feel like? Because we've talked about what do you want it to look like. And I like what you said, Heather. How would you describe that on your resume? I'm going to add that to my toolbox.
I already have a Post-it with it, so I will steal it with pride. And Heather McBee, you will be in my thoughts. Now let's make this a little bit more practical. If you can believe it, we are approaching the middle of our conversation. We will aim to wrap it up just a little bit under 1 hour. So we do give people who will roll with us from one panel to another a small chance to just stretch and restock on coffee, tea, water. We're beverage agnostic here. So back to practicals and Double H, you mentioned metrics. And I would really love to put this conversation in the scenario. Yesterday in our last panel, we talked about two questions that I sometimes use in my work, helping people really streamline their expectations around data and metrics. One is, what is your cutoff date? And the second is, what is your cutoff data? So if we can just imagine, and you can take maybe some real life examples and say, for this, these are the metrics that I would go to. And if you can also support that with maybe linked it to a specific methodology, if that is a relevant information, because there are so many frameworks, methodologies, tools out there that is not just about the data, but is also about how do you sense make of it. So Double H, please.
Well, I'll start here and then see where we go or where this takes us. One example that comes to mind, the conversation around talent and building a talent pipeline, and the data or the metrics that you look at. You look at your internal pipeline, where and then also the diversity of that pipeline, and where what are the type of open roles. So you're looking at some internal data, the people, the roles, the tenure or seniority, performance. What is available in the market externally? What competencies and leadership models do you need, and how does that fit into your broader succession plan, that broader growth strategy as well? And behind that, what type of what's your talent philosophy, if you have one? Do you build, buy, grow? And how does that work for your organization as you continue to grow? Because you've already projected out that the business will grow X% in the next 5 years. How will your people impact that? Is it an inverse or converse relationship? So those are some of the sort of metrics that I might look at and dig deep into. And that's data that I would get, starting with where do you want to start at? Some of that data you can get ahead of time and tell a story and begin at least to tell a starting point. And so to your question about cut off data or what was it? Cut off data, cut off dates and cut off data. Um, that's defined by when you start and when you plan and have where you're going to start. I definitely say you need a cutoff date and data to be able to begin to tell that story. But in the spirit of this conversation and being agile in this process, you have to be agile and look at it and manage it like a project. So where do you want to get to by what time period? Because your business strategy should be or is relatively agile itself.
Mm.
So I'll build on that. One of the key things that and any change is trying to impact productivity in some form or fashion. So if I can understand the productivity numbers, understand revenue per head count, that's like a universal one that we should know. Every meeting I go into, I think about revenue per head count. Like if we're trying to drive some change, some productivity gain, it should result in now I'm getting more revenue with the current headcount that I have, or I'm getting more revenue in incrementally not adding to that, unless it's a growth area. So I can then bifurcate, like if this is this part of the organization, we're trying to do a run strategy, like really be more efficient, run things so that I can fund this big change that we need to do in R&D or over here. So that's not going to look the same revenue per head count in that R&D area as the cash cow area that I'm trying to help fund. But revenue per head count to me is one of those key ones that I never show up to a meeting without thinking of that first. And then cutoff dates. I've never worked in a startup before the past 2 years. So, I was like, oh, year over year. And I'm like going minute over minute now. So, it's in relation to what type of business model you have, where they're at in their evolution, and how much cash runway they have. Right now, it's like we're trying to fly the plane by flapping all of our hands. So.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add for our industry specifically is being in the automotive space. Turnover is a huge driver. We have the automotive industry is notorious for a few things, but specifically in talking about people operations, it's more so notorious for how quickly people churn through the business, and that's not to say they go on to do different things. Sometimes they just go on to different dealerships. So for us, understanding, what turnover looks like and using a specific look back period to continue to be consistent when we do that in the future is one thing that we definitely always want to be on top of. But also something that I feel like is maybe, we're not doing as much of nowadays because organizations are growing so quickly and there's less resources available to do are exit interviews. So for us specifically, we will have sit down face-to-face, either virtually or in person meetings for exiting employees that are, maybe huge losses. But for everyone else, we at least want to have some process in place where we can't dedicate an hour each time we lose an employee. We'd be doing that all day. Some sort of streamlined survey tool to go through the major items for the employee experience and make sure we hit on, did they feel fulfilled for the work they were doing? Compensation-wise, did they feel adequately compensated? Benefits, culture, etc. and then aggregating all of that data to present a picture of this is what people are leaving for, and then identifying what those top priorities are to continue to drive that change to make sure that we are differentiating ourselves from other employers, specifically in the automotive industry.
Well, here's a big one for anyone who has ever done change work or business agility, and it's resistance to change. When we talked about nightmare, a big part of that nightmare is facing resistance to change. Now, my personal deep belief is that resistance to change in and of itself is not inherently bad. It's just a flag that there are data points and insights to really uncover and understand and intentionally address. So, when you hear resistance to change, when you hear people saying we experience resistance to change, how do you harness data and people analytics to make sure that that is turned in your favor?
I'll go. I talk about being a change economist. Just like an economist looks at consumer confidence, we should be looking at employee confidence. And employee confidence comes from that change management or change readiness assessment. And so if you start to, see that as it's more than just, hey, are they think it's going to happen or not? Or, what do they like it or not? It's think about all the things that happen based in our economy, based on consumer confidence and how valuable that data is. It's the same thing with the change readiness assessment. So if I can get the leaders to understand how it's similar, then they start to take that data more seriously. It's not just, again, fluffy HR stuff. Consumer confidence could be considered fluffy economist stuff, but they know that that's what moves the economy. So I want, give me a little second to see if maybe this will help them. If what we're hearing from the employee base is they're not ready, maybe that's the GATE approach that says we need more training, or we need more time, or we need more stakeholder alignment. There's something coming out of that data that's telling us an action plan before we just start ripping the Band-Aid. And that's what I use there.
I'll jump in and build on to what Heather spoke about. I think part of that change readiness and having that change plan ahead of time and segmented communication, a strong and agile change communication plan. And there are signals that tell us why there may be resistance, but how do we communicate what the resistance is or what we've done about that, or how do we lower the resistance? Because sometimes, the bottom line is that there's going to be some level of change. So what's that level of change are we going to tolerate in the midst of the change management? Is it 10%, and knowing that, okay, at some point that 10% will get on board or fall off? But communicating that change and having those communication principles around it and being as transparent as you possibly can. And building in, and especially if it's an organization where, in my experience, I've worked in a lot of organizations that go through a lot of major changes quite frequently, on that communication and transparent communication. And here's why, here's approximately how long it may take. And even more so now with mental health and mental well-being, taking that into consideration and building that into the change plan. I think that reduces resistance, and looking at that at every level, because as part of the change, we forget that as those change agents and catalysts that we get tired too, because what people don't see is that we're working both sides of the table when it comes to the change and advocating with leaders to help them to help coach them through the change.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would like to add to that is, change management there. And the fear of change, generally fear comes psychologically from the fear of unknown, right? So when people don't understand something or don't have all the details to draw connections, they will make those connections themselves. And most often, they're incorrect connections, right? Because they don't have the full story. So, one thing I'd like to just drive home is a story is being told either way. You can either help construct that narrative to make sure everybody is on the same page, understands the rationale behind the change and kind of what it will look like, in the short term, or you can be withholding of that information and say, we're only going to show what we think is necessary to show, and then understand you're going to, be up against more resistance because people are coming to their own conclusions for the reason behind a change. So, just know a story is being told. You can either be a co-author of it, or you can be a reader of it, and hopefully at the end it's not a sad ending, right?
Wonderful. Now, another spin to resistance to change. I am so curious whether, if you look back at your adventures and experiences and projects and various organizations that you worked with or for or within, is there something that keeps popping up and it's like organizations and people are resistant to learn it? Is there a misassumption or a misperception or just something off that they almost refuse to acknowledge and like a traumatic memory that you want to block and not learn from it?
I think we probably have all been victims of poor change management. So I think to that regard, again, psychologically, right, people use past experiences to kind of interpret their present state and maybe what the future looks like. So understanding that, we've all probably been traumatized at some point of a change that maybe had a negative effect on us or someone that we care for. And we take those experiences with us to our next employer or our next organization. They don't, wipe away easily. So I think that may be something just kind of underneath us that we all carry with us. One thing I would say to combat that is, generally HR practitioners or, certain individuals, either if you're a change manager practitioner, OD practitioner, we understand the concept and model of change management very well because we spend so much time educating ourselves on that or learning as we go. And I feel like from a business leadership perspective, that's something we don't give a lot of time or credence to on educating our operations leaders, our business leaders on how to effectively manage change or go through the change process. So essentially we end up being the tour guides, right, for the change management process. And we're trying to manage the change, we're trying to educate, we're trying to tell a story. It becomes very exhausting very quickly. But if everybody had some sort of elementary understanding or knowledge of how organizations change or how to effectively manage change, I feel like you have more people rowing in the right direction versus in the opposite, right?
I'll build on that in that one of the things that I think we just have to voice to the leaders is their jobs have become really crazy hard. 20 years ago, they were given, here's your employee handbook. Here's what people can and can't do. Consistency is the key. Don't let anybody do anything that's not in here. Now it's, hey, we have principle basis. So we want to have, flexibility for the employee. We want to do hybrid. Future work, it's remote. Oh, you don't know how to manage KPIs when they're not sitting with you. Oh, just figure it out. So I think that any of these changes we're putting the leaders through, it's through this lens of, we got to be in their shoes as well, that we're asking a lot of leaders who are trying to drive those business results and do it in a human way. So that's where I start with them to try and get the empathy and understanding. So get them on our side. They're the ones that have to get the people on their side.
Yeah.
And in building a change plan and process, I'd like to make sure that those leading the change, those leaders leading the change, have a part in every part of the change all the way down to the end. Because when you lead the change, the front part, you're done and you're so far ahead of everyone else, you forget what it feels like or what it felt like, or what's, you can be detached from what's actively going on in the change. So being part of that change and building a role for those leaders, even if it's as simple as, and simple may not be all that simple, but communicating, here's the status, here's what we've done, those updates, and then being open for feedback, and like Eli pointed, what's the story, and being able to, throughout the process, co-create that narrative.
Hmm. You made me think about something that I recently been reflecting on quite a lot, on how we oftentimes try to oversimplify complex things and put them into a very clear-cut binary, this or that, either or. And this gets exponentially more complex when you're doing change work, because especially when people ask for data and more analytics, it's almost like they say, hey, help me make a decision, help me make the decision, do I go right or do I go left? And make it clear cut and make it simple. And if we go back to resistance to change, the exact opposite of that is not being over enthusiastic to change. That's not a feeling that you would want your people analytics to put on the table. And just to give a bit of extra comfort and a big hug to everybody involved in doing change management and business agility right now. One of my experiences is that the moment I say that I do change work, everybody, without skipping a beat, they go, oh, you must love change. And my reflex to that is that, let me tell you something. My mom is a doctor. Now, would you expect her to never get sick? And this triggers a conversation along the lines of, don't look for the vanity metrics in people analytics, and really understand that there's an entire spectrum that if you understand it, that's its power. Now, for everybody watching, listening, either now or later, how can they take all this inspiration and all this energy from you and put it into practice? How can they start applying this? Maybe even from tomorrow. I mean, we are talking about business agility, and Heather McBee said from 1 minute to another. So how can they put all this into practice?
I can go quickly. I think for me, incremental but meaningful change is very valuable. Sometimes we look at a problem or an opportunity and say, wow, that's really big. It's going to take us a very long time to one, implement the intervention, but also to see the benefits or the results from it. And I think that adopting an agile framework for change management, you have to be comfortable with the small, quick, easy wins. And then as you start to build some of that confidence or competence, you can then tackle the bigger problems. But I would say from an inspiration perspective, start really small. Start with something that still is meaningful, but is not going to take 6 months to get through, right? Because that's probably the opposite of agile, right? So I would say that would be my recommendation. Let's start small, savor the quick wins, and use that to continue building on more successive wins after the fact.
Double H.
Double H, I'd say a takeaway in learning or working towards change management, for those who love theory, learn get an overview or feel of a couple different change management theories and be able to figure out how you might internalize that. And you may end up melding the two, because one secret is you rarely use one particular theory every time. You take a little bit here and there. So it's more of an art than a science. And I echo what Eli said in terms of starting small and look at what's the overlap between the business or where leaders are driving the change and where employees want. I think if you can find whatever that centerpiece is and that overlap, that's a great place to start, because you will have some level of immediate buy-in and interest, and you can build momentum from the ground up.
Mm.
And I'll build on Double H on taking those, whichever, if it's ProSci or Bridges or Cotter, or any of the other models that you're using, and try and make it consumable to the business. So, when I talked about the change economists, employee confidence, consumer confidence, if you can make that little bit consumable to them, that'll help those leaders as they navigate the change. And then the last thing I would say is make sure you negotiate some credit. So I think we tend to, the change is its own reward. If we're working with those leaders and we're saying, hey, I know that this is, a big impactful change. I'm not saying that, it couldn't have been done without me, but do you think like 10%? Like could I get that little bit? It just reminds them of that there is a science and an art and all these things that you're doing, and everybody needs a little credit for that too. And HR needs to get their credit so that we can then do more changes, have more credibility, get more budget, grow more people. So without the credit, we can't build that as quickly. So get your credit.
Thank you so very much. And I am, my heart is doing a happy dance here, because what I always say is it's mostly about mindset and skill set. Tool set comes second. That's logistics. Understand why and what. What do you need to make it happen? And then the how, whether it's this methodology or that methodology. Let's be very clear. There are a handful of fundamental tools across all of them. So the fundamentals are basic. Now, with about 4 minutes before we say goodbye, and that's always frustrating to do, I do have one last question. As you look back throughout your career and experience enjoying data and people analytics for change management, what is one thing that you had to unlearn and relearn? What was your biggest shift in this journey? And I will give you a few seconds to get inspiration, and I will just thank everybody for being here and reassuring everybody that you can find the recording either on hackinghrlab.io or on our LinkedIn space. This conversation and all the others within this summit and our events. And we will do this as we started. So Heather McBee, you will go first. Just give me a thumbs up when you're ready to go.
Sure, I'm ready.
Good.
For me, one of the biggest things is really efficiency for me probably isn't what is needed for a lot of the things in the business. So if I'm looking at it through that lens only, I'm probably not providing the service. A lot of times we need to eat our own complexity. And so had to relearn that on, if I'm Six Sigma lean, it's like lean through the eyes of what? And I had to reframe through the eyes of whatever outcome we're trying to accomplish as a business.
Wonderful. Thank you. Double H.
One thing I had to adjust or relearn is that presenting the data and adjusting based on your audience and level, and then adjusting in the language of the respective part of the business that you are sharing the data with, or where the change is occurring.
Mm.
I think for me, just understanding that the data is a backup or a tool. It's not necessarily the solution. And I think we can sometimes fall into that trap with the numbers say this, therefore it must be true, or X must be true. But it's really there to support and guide, not to replace experience, on occasion intuition, right? So really leveraging data as a tool for guiding decisions, but not replacing the human element of the decision-making and change management process.
Mm. So happy to hear the word intuition in a conversation about data and people analytics. And I do believe that we need not a conversation, but a series of, the power of intuition when doing change management. Heather McBee, Double H, and Eli, thank you so very much. It was absolutely wonderful. I hope we will get the chance to share panels again very, very soon. And thank you, everybody in the audience. I hope you will be with us for the next conversations in about 5 minutes. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye.
you. everyone, and good whatever moment of the day you are enjoying on your time zones as you are watching or listening in now live or later on in the recording. It's a joy and a privilege to be here hosting the second conversation of the second day of the People and Analytics Global Summit with Hacking HR. My name is Minola Jacques. I will be your co-host for today. We have Barbara with us backstage taking good care of us. So please do make sure you thank her when you enjoy this conversation. And I would love to welcome everybody who just joined now for this part of our conversation, or even more special thanks to people staying with us throughout the day. It's always so rewarding to know that people find our conversations meaningful and helpful. Please do drop us short notes in the comments. Let us know where you're watching from. That also helps with knowing that technology is working. And also, please do consider the chat your conversation space. So engage with the questions that you hear raised in the panel. Drop us your thoughts, your opinions, your own experiences, and make sure you just connect with each other. We're building a community after all. And also, do drop us any resources around the topic that you have found particularly useful and helpful. Now, without further ado, Barbara, please do help me bring awesome people onto the screen. And wow, so many of my favorite people in one place. It's always a treat. Now, usually Hacking HR hours are shorter than normal hours, and this one will be a tiny little bit even shorter, because we do aim to wrap it up just under 1 hour, allowing people to get water, coffee, tea, a little bit of movement in between our conversations. So let's make the most out of our time together, and we will start off very easy. A round of introductions, and I will ask each and every one of you to just give us a sneak peek into your experience, and also, for the purpose of our conversation today, what is your perspective on employee engagement? And we will do this clockwise as you appear on my screen. So Roxanne, you will be our pioneer today. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I always somehow end up being first in these. But I'm happy to be here, and thank you again so much, and welcome to my fellow panelists. So Roxanne Lotso, I've been involved in Hacking HR panels and activities since the beginning, so I'm super excited to be back. I'm the head of people analytics at a tech company based here in Austin, and I've been doing kind of satisfaction engagement type work since grad school, honestly. So I've been doing survey type work and measurement with the foundation of analytics underneath that for a long time. So I'm happy to be here and chatting about that. And when I think about concept of employee engagement and what that really means, there's a lot of different definitions out there. But when I think about fundamentally how have I looked at it and how have I measured it and how have I used it to help businesses make decisions, it's really around, do people have an emotional connection to the work that they do? And does that connection actually drive high performance, which in the end enhances and increases business results? So to me, it's all about the kind of well-being and connection that people have with their organization, but fundamentally the outcome is you're enhancing business performance. So that's kind of the perspective that I've always taken looking at it.
Thank you. Welcome. Stephanie, good to see you again. It's been, what, 2 hours?
Yes. Great to see you again as well. And I think Roxanne goes first because she's got such great answers. And that'll be tough to follow. My name's Stephanie Lemek. I am a former HR executive turned HR consultant, fractional leader, and I also founded an organization called the Wounded Workforce, which is dedicated to help building trauma-informed workplaces. And to add on to what Roxanne said, which she summed it up so beautifully, when I think about employee engagement, I really think about something that started out as, the best in class companies were the only ones really talking about doing it when I first started my HR career to now. And in the near future, where it is absolutely a non-negotiable as we look at the changing demands of the workforce and how much information we now have around how employee engagement drives business results. So excited to be here.
Thank you. What a joy to welcome you back, Lisa. Good to see you.
Hi, everybody. So, I think of employee engagement, and I think a lot of companies bundle it together with employee satisfaction. And I think they're two different things, personally. Employee engagement for me does not mean employee happiness, right? It's, for somebody to be happy at work, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're tied to their work. As Roxanne said, do they feel a connection to what they're doing? Do they feel like they're making an impact on the organization, which everyone wants to feel that, right? Regardless of what role you're in, everyone wants to feel valued and that you're contributing to the bottom line, the company's vision, the mission, upholding their core values, etc. So I think that it's important to differentiate them, that it's not about happiness. It's about them feeling tied to the work that they do for the company and in service of the company. And that's kind of what I think of employee engagement. Satisfaction is something different. That's another session.
Thank you so much. And Rod, so grateful you're here against, time zone and weather challenges. We will take every minute that we can have having you with us.
Well, this like I've been doing hacking HR panels as well for a long time. This is one of the best time zone ones I've ever done. It's only 5:30 a.m. That's normally 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. So this is awesome. So I'm more awake today. In terms of the question, I'm Rod Hutchings. Worked for Kyndryl. Also part of the Air Force in Australia, and I'm also part of high performance volleyball teams. I've got volleyballs behind me, and there's a connection between them all. Is I think that we were speaking to Air Force cadets on the weekend, and I think a key thing of engagement is really helping people also find again the purpose, which has been mentioned, their connection.
Well, that's the weather playing tricks on us. We lost you for a tiny little bit when you mentioned finding the connection, and we were ready to take notes, and then you disappeared.
Yeah, I think I think I started talking about on the weekends. We're speaking to Air Force cadets, so people entering the Air Force, and talking to them about finding what they love. So how to we as an organization help them find that and that get that connection. My connection's really dying. Sorry about that.
No worries. We will make the most we can out of it. In all the conversations, in one way or another, the question around how do we make sure that we don't get overwhelmed or over distracted by data and people analytics popped up. So when we are called to do, employee engagement work and to drive employee engagement conversations, how do you filter and sort through all the data and analytics that is available? And let's go diagonally. I don't know why I do this. Lisa, can you please lead us into this?
Yeah, we talked about this yesterday, Manola, a little bit in the session that we had, and I think that analytics is super important. The caution that I give people is that once you get those analytics and that data, right? Data is important. I love data. I think I'm a very data-driven person, but at some point, I step away from the data, and I lean towards it's like a combination, or it meets halfway of what I know, right? We know our organizations, or at least we should. We know our people. We know things that analytics aren't going to tell us, right? And engagement is one of those squishy things, right? That really requires, HR teams and leaders to kind of merge them, right? What we know and the analytics, and somewhere in the middle is your answer and where you should be testing and experimenting, right? That's kind of how I feel like data should, analytics should be approached. It's super important, but it's not, you don't action on analytics. I don't think, personally.
One thing I like to think of is how you're using your data to drive conversation. So in follow up to what Lisa said, you can't, the numbers, the data isn't just going to tell you exactly what you need to do. There's more beyond that. There's understanding the organization. There's additional conversations to have. And this is maybe a silly little story, but this is one that was impactful for me, is, a really standard metric that I've used throughout my career is tracking turnover. And so, I had an HR dashboard I was presenting and discussing in a leadership meeting every month, and we discussed turnover. And I found, because we were talking about turnover, we talked about every exit, and we re-examined them and kind of engaged in these conversations that were very reflective in perhaps not the most productive way, kind of finding reasons to excuse exits. And so something I tried was transitioning to conversations that were more proactive. So I started using a retention metric that I presented primarily to drive those discussions instead of turnover, because instead we were focused on who was staying with the team, who we could continue to have an impact on. And I think the nuance there has a lot to do with the team you're working with. So knowing my team would gravitate to, let's talk about every person who left and kind of explain it away, instead shifted to retention. How can we think about supporting our existing employees? I think the context and conversation around analytics can be even more important than the data sometimes, because you have to be able to extrapolate that to conversation and meaningful action.
Yep. I really love both of those comments. And I just want to step back and say, the word people is in people analytics. So fundamentally, we're not just looking at data. We're actually considering there's a real human element to what we're doing here. And there's no data and there's no experiment and there's no measurement in the world that can perfectly capture the employee experience and employee engagement. So that's just the fact of what we're working with, right? So yes, the data and insights should inform, or like what you said, Stephanie, start to guide the conversations. But really, it's just one data point of many, right, in a bigger conversation around what this all means. And so I partner pretty closely with our business partners. Like those conversations, Stephanie, you were talking about turnover versus retention. Those are the kind of things where you need that kind of institutional knowledge or insight from the business partners, as an example, who are really working closely with the businesses and the leaders and the managers on a day-to-day basis to understand the context and the story behind it. We can look at dashboards, we can do analysis all day long, and we can find what the patterns are, but we need to build in that story. Otherwise, it's not really worthwhile. So I go back to this, like there's a people in people analytics, and we can't forget that's fundamentally what we're here doing, and what we're measuring is people.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in just because, Stephanie, the story that you told brought a story to mind that I think would be interesting. So I joined a company that, I kid you not, when I implemented an HRIS system and put in the data, back data, they had a 209% turnover in the running 12 months. Now, anybody else would have run screaming from the building, right? And gone, oh my God, I made the biggest mistake of my life. But instead, it to your point, Stephanie and Roxanne, it led me to have those conversations and figure out the why, right? And those things nobody had been talking about those things, right? Nobody had even asked. Nobody had talked to any of the business leaders about what was going on. And it was just a mass exodus, it kept people's heads spinning. So I think that you're right, that it's those types of things that you go, oh, okay, there's a problem. Clearly, now the people part comes in and I have to find out why, right? It gives you the information to then go action on people, right?
You tempted me with something. In the previous conversation, we had a question around what are the skills that we need to develop, both within the HR function, but equally within the business, to be able to have the most meaningful and helpful people analytics driven conversations. And I would like to bring that question into our conversation as well. What are the skills within the HR and within the business that we need to proactively develop to really take full value out of employee engagement? I do believe that there has to be a bridge, and it's not just on one side that we need to upskill or be proactive with it. And Roxanne, well, you go first, so please go first.
Yeah, absolutely. So I absolutely agree that it goes both ways. And I think from the HR perspective, we need to develop and enable a different type of data literacy in terms of how do we use all of these insights that we get from analytics teams to actually have meaningful conversations with business leaders and integrate it with what we know is happening with our people. So there's a really big data literacy piece that I think is important. You don't have to be a statistician. You don't have to know how to, interpret a bunch of results, but you have to be able to talk about data in a language, in a way that your business leader can think about it, because business leaders, for the most part, are very data driven, right? Now, from the business side, I think there's this element of, again, you have to consider that you're dealing with humans here, right? They're not widgets. These are people with real emotions, real problems. If you do any reading at all around kind of the state of engagement, employee experience, well-being is a huge topic. Started to come up during the pandemic. It is still a huge topic, right? Atlassian, Microsoft have put out recently some really interesting kind of insights and talking about how they really focus on that. So I think part of it from the business perspective is also getting those leaders to understand there's a human element. I mean, it sounds very simple, but it's very real. There's a human element to how you actually engage and motivate and manage your teams that actually drive high performance. You can get somebody to accomplish a task or do work in a lot of different ways. You can force them to do it, or you can really inspire and engage them to do it, right? And that has a direct impact on the sustainability of those types of activities. And engagement is also related to manager effectiveness and belief in your manager. So all of these things come together in one kind of big circle.
I absolutely agree around data literacy for HR professionals. I think, some of the best advice I can give an HR professional, at any stage of their career, but especially, in that early to mid-level, is speak the language your business speaks. Don't speak a different language, because you're not going to understand each other. And a great resource I found personally for data literacy, or how to leverage data in the right way to partner with the business, there's this great book called Storytelling with Data. So I think that's a great way to start building that skill set, and it's really important. I also think there's some things that are super important, I think, both for HR and leaders, and I would say that's active listening. We talk about this data and how, it can be a clue, not necessarily the answer. So you've got to use that active listening. You kind of have to put your Nancy Drew hat on a little. What is this data telling us that needs more to uncover? And I think the last thing, and I would really push this to leaders, but I also think HR has a hand in this. I think transparency is really important when it comes to analytics. obviously you have to be thoughtful about the transparency, what you're sharing. We don't want to breach any confidentiality. But a lot of times I see organizations make a huge and costly mistake when they engage in surveys or data collection, and then they're not transparent with their team, what they're doing with the information, what actions they're taking, and what follow-up exists. I mean, this is especially true when it comes to employee surveys. But it's really important to kind of close the loop, close the gap, because I think that transparency piece, you know, if I don't know what you're doing with my data, I don't know that I want to give it to you. That exists in organizations too. So those are the things that come to mind in addition to what Roxanne shared.
And welcome back, Rod. Would you like to test the connection now? Oh, I guess that settles it. Lisa, please.
Absolutely. I agree 100% with Roxanne and Stephanie. I think those are very important. I'm going to add on the squishy part. Employee engagement is the emotional commitment that an employee has to its organization. Emotional is the word. And the only way for you to know that is to be communicating, to be listening, and to create a culture where open communication and honest dialogue is welcomed. Right? If you don't feel safe, to your point, Stephanie, sharing, well, then your data is going to be bad, right? It's just going to be bad data because people will stop talking. And when people stop talking, you have a problem. And that problem grows. And it's like, it'll just bleed into every part of the company. So I think that it's, one of the key, and I think this is for not only the HR teams, but for businesses, is to understand the human element of it, and that it requires them to have a commitment to the employee as much as they have a commitment to us, right? It's a two-way street. It doesn't go just one way. So really develop those skills, those human skills.
This conversation reminded me of a great book. It's NFL coach Bill Walsh's The Score Will Take Care of Itself. And it basically advocates that a great coach doesn't coach for the board, but it coaches for the team. And I would love to hear your thoughts on how can we talk about employee engagement in the workplace with data and people analytics that will drive this message, that it's not about the metrics and it's not about the results and it's not about the vanity metrics in surveys or whatever it is. How can we make these conversations about the team and about the people inside the organization, and less about percentages or numbers as a snapshot? And Stephanie, I know that this is near and dear to your heart, and you have a special lens to it.
Oh, you make me feel, you're making me think of this conversation I've had so many times with so many leaders, and it's around an interesting metric, but a metric nonetheless. It's Glassdoor ratings. I mean, I wonder how many conversations, HR partners, HR leaders in general have had around Glassdoor ratings and a dissatisfaction around Glassdoor ratings. And how do we fix the number? How do we fix the metric? Because, there is real value to the Glassdoor metrics, but when you're just focused on, well, I want this to be good, it becomes a bit of a vanity metric, to your point. And I always say, well, you can't magically fix Glassdoor. You fix Glassdoor by fixing the common theme issues that we're also seeing that are a common theme in the feedback we're getting from our internal employees. People hate that answer, but it's the truth. And it's the same thing with any of the other things we relate on employee engagement surveys. It's not about the number, it's about looking at past data, future data, looking at progress, looking at changes, and the adjustment to the actions. And I think this gets back to, the comment I made before around transparency. It's what are we doing to address these challenges around whether it's employee engagement, whether it's turnover metrics, whether it's diversity metrics. How can we be transparent and discuss the actions we're taking to make progress? I think is really what's important.
Yeah, so the action part is super, super key. And I'm really glad you brought that up, Stephanie. And multiple organizations I've worked at where we've measured action planning success. It is directly predictive of increases or decreases in engagement on the next survey. Like that's not that's an actual fact, right? The extent to which that might vary by company, but there's tons of research, and I've seen in every company I've been with, including most recently in our survey, is that we know there's a direct correlation between those two things. But the way I think about hooking the leaders on the importance of it is tying it back to do the data again in the research that says, we know this is linked to business outcomes. So Microsoft just did a big study via their Glint people science team, and they found that employee engagement is linked to earnings per share, right? Gallup has been doing this type of research for decades and decades and have tons and tons of research that say an increase in engagement is directly correlated to an increase in revenue. So it's like kind of giving them the business case and then bringing in the human side of it, right? Like, you have to care about your people. You have to pay attention to your people. You have to be aware of what's going on in their life. You have to pay attention to all of these human things to actually enable them to do their best work, right? But I think still from a business perspective, you still have to make that hook to tie it into the bottom line so they understand like, oh, wow, this actually has an impact on the outcomes in my business.
Yeah, I agree, Roxanne, and I think that both of you had great points in that it's about communication. I'll just use that word. It's communication, right? You can't hold that information and not share it, right? It's useless, first of all, and you're not going to be able to leverage it in the way that you were saying, Roxanne, is that you share that information with your teams, your company, whatever. They see the correlation, right? And then they have a story, right? And I'm going to go back to what you said, Stephanie, is that it's a lot about stories, right? And everyone will have their own version of the story, and that's okay. But companies are responsible for sharing information so that stories can be built, right? And also sharing their stories. Another book, Manola, that is absolutely fabulous. If anybody is interested in reading, it's called Legacy. It's the book about the All Blacks. Have you read it, Roxanne? Yeah, it's an amazing book. Very similar in feel of Bill Walsh. I knew Bill Walsh personally, an extraordinary leader. And I won't even just use the word coach, but an extraordinary leader. And this book is it's fantastic. So anybody who is an avid reader of this, it's a really good one. And it talks a lot about that, right? Creating a story. No one, I always say, there is no job that I am too big to do. Period.
That almost feels like the mic drop for this conversation. So let's take this into a little bit more practical. We are at the middle of our time together. For anyone listening, and maybe they are facing going into the first employee engagement journey in their career, or they really want to turn the employee engagement landscape around in their organization, what would your advice be? And that's a truly open question. What type of data, what skills, where to start, basically. And let's do this popcorn style. See how the unmuting competition goes.
Okay, I'll go first on this one. I've done this a few times. So I think this is a whole conversation in itself. So I'll try to be brief, but I think there's a couple good things. So when this is your first journey, I highly recommend partnering with an external vendor and not doing it yourself, because that's a way I can guarantee you're not going to get very far, right? And you're not going to get the buy-in often from the employees around confidentiality assurances. So I would say find a good vendor to partner with that can help you discuss a lot of the key points around survey design. There's a whole art, there's a whole science, there's books, there's courses. I took courses in grad school around how to do this, right? And so I think when you really kind of start from a strong foundation of scientific evidence in terms of what you're asking and how you're asking it, that's a really important step. And I also think, you have to align the content of the survey with the strategic priorities in the business, right? So don't just go and start to throw a bunch of questions together because they're interesting to you. What is really important to the business? And can you want to be asking questions that you can actually take action on, right? So I think that's something really important. And every time I do a survey in an organization, every year we revisit what that content is and we validate it. Because guess what? A lot has changed in the last year and a half from when you may have done your last survey. I can guarantee your business priorities have changed. I can guarantee a lot has changed in terms of what's important to people since the pandemic, right? So you really need to be continually refining and validating that, and just setting it up, I think, in the best way from the beginning will help you continue to set that foundation going forward. I think that the second thing I would think about is you need to have buy-in from leaders in the business as to why this is important. It can't be Roxanne and Stephanie and Lisa, or maybe the head of people or something going out and talking about this. You have to have business leaders who are advocates and partners in this, talking about the importance, giving examples of why this is important to them and how they've used it to measure employee experience or to make change and progress in their business. So I think those are two really big things, that the setup and having an advocate for you in the business that can help you frame up the entire program.
I completely agree, especially partnering with an external vendor is so important if you're able to do it, because there's so much to navigate through. I will say, have a plan for the whole experience, the whole project, to add on to what Roxanne is saying. Do not just say, here's our plan for the employee survey. It needs to be, here's your plan for communicating ahead of the survey. Here's your plan for communicating during the survey period, the whole process there. And then what's the plan afterwards? I spent some time working at Gallup, and that's a best practice from Gallup. It is the full process. And so once you've completed the survey, you want to review the results, and then you want to take action, and then you want to communicate back those actions. If you're not setting up that full plan, that full scheme, you haven't completed the project. So make sure that full scope is understood and supported by the business when you're going into this process. And it doesn't need to be a 200 question survey. Keep it simple. Love what Roxanne said, align it to your business priorities. I think that's super important. And here's maybe a not so friendly piece of advice, but just like a hold your leaders accountable piece of advice. Don't let leaders use surveys to replace the conversations they need to be having with their team members. Employee engagement surveys are amazing tools, amazing resources. They are not a replacement for actively managing and leading your teams. So if leaders are saying, oh, it would be really great to understand this, let's do a survey. Hey, HR, go do a survey. Nope, time out. Because employee engagement surveys should be that strategic tool we're talking about. It shouldn't be a, hey, here's this little task because I don't feel like doing the part of my job that requires me to talk to our team, get to know our team, and understand what's going on. Because as we've talked about before, you're going to have to do that work anyway, even once you have the data. So don't kind of give in to we'll just do a survey instead of actively listening to the team.
Yep, I agree 100% with both of you, Roxanne and Stephanie. Absolutely use an outside company. I've tried it the other way. It doesn't work. It's not good. Nobody believes us that it's confidential. So don't do it. To just build on what you said, Roxanne, and making sure that the questions you ask are aligned to what the business needs to know, right? What do we need to know? Again, do not make it a 200 question survey. Nobody will finish it. 10 max, like literally 10, and they need to be really impactful. I've always worked with, as I build out those questions with, the heads of teams, right? Kind of do during my one-on-ones go, okay, this is what we're thinking about doing. What do you need, right? What are you looking to know, right? What questions do you have? Because everyone's going to have different, they're going to want different data, right? They're going to want different information, and then craft the questions around that, and obviously make sure they're tied, and usually they are, to the business, and they do not, and under no circumstance do they take the place of one-on-ones. Never. Like, when I hire managers, and if you have a direct report, I have a rubric that you get. I walk you through it of how to have your one-on-ones. They're held once a week. The notes are shared with me in the platform that I use, which is, I just happen to use ChartHop. I go in and look at them. I look at the notes from one-on-ones. I make sure they're happening, because if they're not, then again, we need to have a conversation, right? If there are action items that are sitting out week after week after week, I need to go and circle around with that person and go, okay, how do I help you get unstuck here, right? What can I do to move this along? But you having an action item for 6 weeks outstanding is not good for the relationship or the company, right? So they do not replace one-on-ones. That's 100% not okay.
The next question is a 3-part invitation. And I just thought of it. So bear with me, we will build it as we go. I was thinking back to many conversations, either lived through or heard about or shared in other panels. And we will go through 3 scenarios. The first one is, how do we navigate and how do we use data and analytics to navigate employee engagement conversations that start with, oh my God, this is a disaster. And then, who's to blame starts to, appear. So how do we navigate a conversation with, this is the worst I've seen, back to Lisa's point, 209% turnover. Who's to blame for this? How do we navigate that type of conversations using data, people analytics, and all the human superpowers we can tap into?
I think it's unproductive most of the time to focus on who's to blame. There may be exceptions to that rule. Those exceptions are probably when there is a series of protracted data. It's over time where clearly, the data is clearly pointing to someone being to blame. I think I really love action planning for a variety of reasons, but this is where I love action planning as a tool to look forward instead of looking back. It's like, okay, this data is giving us information. It's not helpful to think about who's to blame. Let's think about how we move forward and rectify this situation and what that looks like. And then establish accountability around the action plan. So what can be challenging if we're getting new information, new data, and that data is telling us, oh, wow, this is terrible. Probably there was a lack of accountability to start with around whatever was driving that metric. So through action planning, you can, create a path forward, and you can also drive accountability. So if there is someone who's not kind of taking ownership, taking action as needed, that makes a lot more sense to, blame or hold someone accountable. But when it's just a point of data without any previous conversation, action, accountability assigned to it, it's not a helpful or productive discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess I'm all about reframing. So if we have data that's really bad, I say, congratulations, people were really honest with us, and we should be thankful that people were really honest with us, because now we know where we have opportunities, right? And so I know like for leaders, it can be very threatening or scary, but I'm like, this is awesome. Like we couldn't have asked for better data because now we know that people aren't satisfied, engaged, et cetera, with certain elements. And now it's an opportunity. And I talk a lot to leaders about like, how do you frame the follow-up conversations with your teams? It's not, why did we do poorly here? It's like, tell me what like a really good situation looks like. Like, help me understand what a really, really great experience around XYZ is, right? It's not about peeling back the onion to figure out the 50 things that are wrong right now. It's like, let's think about what is that ideal situation and what does that look like? And is it feasible for us to get there? So it's totally reframing the conversation from blaming and negativity to like, well, what does positivity look like? And help me understand what that is. And I think it was Stephanie or Lisa, I can't remember which one who said it, around active listening. Leaders have to be proactively, actively curious and open to the good and the bad and everything in between when they're having these conversations. And they have to actually be willing to be authentic and accept some accountability when maybe there is something that's happened and they could have done a better job, right? And so they have to commit and be accountable and actually take the action on the back end as well.
And I want to add, Roxanne, you reminded me of something that I think is super important and a great, actionable tip for folks out there doing action planning around employee engagement surveys. It is so natural to focus only on the lowest scores or what needs to be fixed. I cannot recommend more heartily. Every time I do this or support a client in doing this, I recommend if you want to talk about the bottom 3 answers or the bottom 3 scores, you better also talk about those top 3 scores and balance the conversation. How can we maintain these things that are going right? Because that's so important. That's so vital too. How do we keep doing the things that are good? And then also, let's also talk about where we can get better. But balancing that conversation is important. So you're focusing on keeping things that are good going well, but you're also managing the perception of your employees, of your leaders. If you're only talking about the bad things, people are fixating on all the things that are wrong and who to blame. But when you're focusing on what's amazing and then what's a challenge to kind of maintain and then bring up, it just shifts the conversation, and I think in such a positive way.
Yep. And you reminded me of a story, and for those really great things you're doing where you're scoring highly, people are very satisfied, engaged, whatever, it's like you can't keep doing the same thing to keep people satisfied and happy and engaged around those. You have to continue to do new and different things. And so there's an old story from Walt Disney after the 3 Little Pigs came out, and people kept saying, when are we going to do the next 3 Little Pigs? And he said, you can't top pigs with pigs. We have to do something bigger and better. And I mean, it exactly applies. We can't top super happy, engaged employees by doing the same thing continually. We have to continually be innovative and think outside of the box to find ways to keep them like that. The same thing doesn't work time and time again.
You anticipated scenario number 2, so we will go more in depth there. Now, Lisa, let's stay a little bit in scenario number 1. Really bad figures.
I don't have a whole lot more to add. Roxanne and Stephanie hit on most of it, but I do think that Roxanne, that and you probably have seen this. HR doesn't typically innovate, right? We have a playbook. We follow the playbook, and oftentimes don't color outside the lines, right? It's part of our DNA. And I think that we need to start coloring more outside the lines. We need to write a new playbook, right? Because the last 3 years have shown us that playbook probably needs to be thrown out and rewritten, right? Mm-hmm. Things have changed. Everything has changed, right? We can't assume that the same stuff that we've been doing, like you can't keep doing those things and think, oh, it's good, but just leave that alone, right? We have to innovate too. We have to change. We have to adapt. We have to come up with cool new ways to keep engagement up. I think that, I'm going to talk on the blame game thing that, it happens a lot. When I had that situation with that ridiculous turnover, you can imagine the blame game that went on there. And it wasn't just one way, it was both. Right. And which was shocking. But, I used that, first of all, to your point, you have to change the context of the conversation. Like, okay, clearly we have a problem. Come to the table with ideas of how we fix it. right? Don't come to the table complaining more about it or blaming people. Like, that's totally unproductive and just makes it more negative, right? And it gets nowhere, right? You can't make an action plan when people come and just complain and complain and complain and then go, well, it's your problem, and walk out. I've had people do that in one-on-ones. They're like, well, they'll complain, and they go, but that's your problem. And they'll get up and walk out. I'm like, oh, no, stop. That's not how it goes. That's not how I work. You know that. Sit down. Let's talk more about this, right? I want to know your ideas, right? So I think that that's important too, is to, change the narrative of the story of, yep, we have some challenges here. We have an opportunity to excel. Let's talk about that, right? How do we do that together, right? And create that safe space that, for authentic dialogue, right? Like, it's critical. And it's not something that I would say, I wasn't talking about authentic dialogue 3.5 years ago. I was practicing it, but I wasn't talking about it, right? And, the whole pandemic certainly changed things. And, we're talking more about being authentic, right? And having open conversations and creating and giving permission to people to come to a meeting, free of judgment, trust, all of that, and just be authentic, right?
Thank you. Now, following the natural energy towards speaking about the good stuff, scenario number 2, you have leaders looking at the employee engagement, and these are stellar numbers. Just, keep doing what we're doing. And back to your point, Roxanne, with, don't put pigs on top of pigs. How do we go forward from there when we have this kind of reaction?
Like, I think one thing that we haven't talked a lot about here is engagement is the outcome. Everything else we measure are the drivers of engagement, right? So engagement is the ultimate outcome, and we don't action on engagement. We action on what are all the other important things that are part of a very broad and important employee experience that actually influence that outcome that we're looking for, which is highly engaged employees. And so I think it's really around, well, how are we going to continue to do X, Y, Z? And are you looking at the rest of the data on your survey? You might have a great engagement score, but I can guarantee you your engagement drivers have changed over time, right? And so different drivers, depending on what's going on in the company. Do you have a new leadership team? Do you have a new CEO? Is there a world war that's about to break out? I mean, all of these things impact what's going to drive engagement at any given point in time for a company. So it's really around, okay, engagement is great. What are we going to do to keep it there? Let's look at how some of the drivers of engagement and kind of the leading indicators of that have changed over time, and what do we need to do differently around those?
Yeah, I agree, Roxanne. I've been talking a lot recently about how actions need to be outcome-based, right? You have to be thinking of what do you want to get from this, right? Where are we going to be if this goes perfectly, right? Or it goes amazing? Like, what does that outcome look like, right? And then that will drive your actions, right? And that is something that I've been talking a lot about lately with, my leaders and in my network, is, kind of switching that and thinking about the outcomes, right? I write my job descriptions based on outcomes, right? I switched it last year because job descriptions are boring and they talk about, all kinds of, like flowery stuff. Like, they're just, bleh. People want to know what am I going to be responsible for, right? Tell me what outcome you're looking for from if I were to be in this role, right? And it changed the DNA of people who applied for roles dramatically. I had less people applying that probably didn't even read the job description, right? Like, I don't even know what you read, but it wasn't that job description. It helped tremendously. So, outcome-based really for so many things is key.
I love the outcome-based comment. I think it's spot on. And I think it's challenging, yourself as a leader, your organization, if you're not tying employee engagement to outcomes. Is it just a vanity metric? Like, why are you doing it then? Is it just to be able to say, here's my gold star? And And, for some organizations, maybe they want to do an employee engagement survey or participate in things to be able to say, hey, look at my gold star when they're out recruiting. I mean, that's still an outcome. But I think really tying back to the why behind and digging into the data and understanding. Otherwise, your employee engagement becomes a check the box. And I think when you ask people to provide survey data and they know it's check the box, I think that in itself starts to erode engagement or belief within the organization because it's not genuine. So even those high scores continuously, if nothing meaningful is happening, or there's no connection back to the work, there's no meaning, people pick up on that and it's not well received.
Now, we are getting very, very quickly close to wrapping up this conversation, and I wish we had at least 10 more hours to go. Now, very quickly go through scenario number 3, because I do believe there might be something there that would help a lot of people listening to us. When you are in a conversation and someone says, I really don't know what to make out of all of this, it's all over the place, maybe it wasn't the right time, it wasn't the right survey, we asked the wrong questions. How do we go from there? And in the interest of time, I will ask Lisa to lead us, and then we go Stephanie and Roxanne.
Yeah, I mean, data can be overwhelming. It is, that's a thing, right? And I think synthesizing it is important, right? And that's our job, right? To kind of take that data, boil it down, so that it's consumable, right? And it's otherwise it's just, oh my God, it's so much, right? And then people check out, right? Nope, that's too much. I can't do that, right? Because you're asking them to do, to use a part of their brain that they're just is used in something else, right? In their job, not that. So you have to synthesize it. And some of the data you won't bring to the table, right? That's our call, right? Maybe this is something I bring, we talk about in 6 months or in 3 months or whatever, right? We don't have to talk about it right now. It's not a, the house on fire thing, right? You don't have to give it all, right? Like it can be a lot.
Thank you. Stephanie.
I love what you said, Lisa, about synthesizing the information. I think this is the strategic piece. This is the partnership piece. This is where you're pulling all of those things we talk about together, knowing the business, active listening, understand the priorities and how the data kind of prioritizes to point to what actions we can take and interpret it in a strategic way. It's important because otherwise we look at it and think, oh, we got to boil the ocean. No one can do that. It's overwhelming. It's setting leaders, the organization, yourself up for failure. So it's really understanding how to prioritize. And if you're worried about the data being kind of bonkers bananas, and this is your first time doing a survey, maybe even prioritize before you're getting the information back. So you already have that clear priority from the business agreed upon. So as you're synthesizing the data, as you're presenting information and action, you have that to go back to, and everyone's on the same page of that, here's what we're tackling first, second, third.
Yep. And I think this is where expertise in survey design and research and people analytics and doing this in companies comes in handy, because you're able to immediately determine and focus some of the areas you should be looking at. So my company, we just did our big global survey, and I could spend the next 20 days sitting down and analyzing the data, but I'm not going to do that. I had 4 to 5 kind of really specific things I wanted to drill into. I knew there's certain things going on in certain businesses, so I drilled down into that. So you really have to understand kind of from just experience and what's going on in the business, where are some areas to focus. And I think if you have a situation where a team or a person is kind of trying to boiling the ocean, you might not actually have the right people in charge or responsible for running some of that business. And you really need to have someone who understands kind of the strategies and the priorities of the company a little bit more to be able to direct and guide and prioritize what you're doing and what you're looking at.
Thank you so very much. This was absolutely wonderful. And we have time, just enough time for the punchline wrap-up round. And if you look back at all your journeys, through so many conversations around employee engagement and using data and people analytics to drive those conversations. What is your biggest takeaway? If you can boil it down into, a mic drop sentence, what would that be? And we will do it exactly how we started. So we will go Roxanne, Stephanie, and Lisa.
I'm going to say that looking at manager effectiveness is the single most important metric you should embed in an employee engagement survey.
Thank you. Stephanie.
If you're not starting with an outcome or a purpose, you are not realizing the full impact of employee engagement data.
Thank you. And Lisa.
Well, you took mine, so thanks for that. Yeah, I can't think of anything more than, outcome. They have to be outcome based, right? There's just no other way to do it.
Thank you very much, Roxanne, Stephanie, and Lisa for being here today. Also, a big thank you to Rob for really, really trying to be here. Everybody in the audience, such a joy to host you. I hope I will see as many of you as possible in the next conversation, which is the last one in our summit today. And I hope I will get to welcome many of you and people who you will recommend Hacking HR to in many future panels. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day, of your week, and enjoy data. Thank you. everyone, and good whatever moment of the day you are enjoying on your time zones, listening or watching now as we are live or later on with the recording. It's such a joy to kick off the third and final conversation in our second day of the second edition of Hacking HR's People Analytics Global Summit. My name is Minola Jacques. I will be your co-host for the next hour or so. Also, we have Barbara backstage taking good care of us, so please do give her a lot of credit when you enjoy this conversation. And we have an amazing lineup of speakers for the next hour, and it will be a gift just hearing their insights and sharing their energy for this topic. So Barbara, please do help me bring those wonderful people on the screen. And while they pop up, I will just take an extra second and welcome everybody joining as we speak, and also encourage everybody to consider the comments and the chat your own conversation space. Do drop your answers, thoughts, opinions when you hear the questions that we raise in our conversation. And also, please, what we found immense value in is whether you have a resource related to the topic that you found particularly helpful and meaningful in your work, whether it's a book, an article, a tool, something that has a link to it, drop it in the comments, and let's keep this community growing. Now, Hacking HR hours feel shorter than regular hours, so I will stop my blabathon right here and open the floor to you. The first round is easy. You are all Hacking HR veterans. You know how it goes. I will pass the e-mic around as you appear on my screen. Clockwise, some things never change. And I will ask you to just shortly introduce yourselves and do share with us, why is this topic of diversity by design so meaningful to you that you committed your time and your energy to be here today? Sundari, welcome.
Hi, Minola, and hi everyone. Lovely to be here today. It's 3:30 a.m. in Hong Kong. So definitely I wanted to be here, otherwise I wouldn't be up. I think that sort of answers that question. Yeah. After spending corporate life with Unilever and then ANZ in India, as they say, the entrepreneurial bug bit me. So what I do today is run an organizational consultancy practice where, and I still call it practice because we are learning from people around us, right? So it's my big, hairy, audacious goal to help people be more human at work through storytelling. And thanks, Minola, for hosting this, and really lovely to be here with everyone. While 3:30 a.m. is a compelling enough reason, I think it's also one of the exercises that I saw somebody do was creating this thing called a trust circle. So you see who's in your first level, who's in your second level, and who's in your third level. And stretching that exercise, if you actually create let's say an Excel sheet and put those people down and say, put their names, put their genders, put their orientations and everything else, all the other dimensions. That sort of gives you a sense of how diverse you actually are with your networks. And I think that's the first round of data collection for ourselves and the introspection that I want to leave everyone with.
Thank you. And I just want to make it clear that, such difficult and challenging hours are not part of our diversity by design approach. It's just the reality of sharing a world that has different time zones. Barry, so good to see you. Welcome.
Thanks, Manola, and hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Bahare Sultani. You can call me Barry. My pronouns are she, her, and I have the privilege to serve as the head of diversity, equity, and inclusion and people reporting at a retail tech company called Stitch Fix. And really, I'm in this platform and in this work to work together and ensure that we're centering the most marginalized communities in our work as a company and as a team, because we know that that's what helps elevate everyone's experiences.
Thank you. Alexis, welcome. Good to see you.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. Alex Prasis. My last role was actually leading global DEI, and I started up the function. So there was a ton of work around data strategy, and it was a Workday company. So, you know, of course, it was Workday reporting. If you've never experienced it yet, good luck to you when you do. But no, we got through that. And currently, you know, just doing consulting around culture and change. So the reason why I'm really passionate about this, I think stems back to, I will make this quick. Undergrad and grad school, my degrees are in African American studies. And a lot of my research was thinking about systems and disparate impact, right? And how can the data help you paint the story? You may hear the anecdotes, but how does the data really tell you what's going on? And kind of marrying the quantitative and the qualitative to tell the full story. So you've probably heard art and science of data, and that's kind of been a through line. I'm also big on building, transforming, employee engagement, employee experience. So that kind of all converges, I feel like here. I'm really passionate about the power of people analytics, particularly when it comes to equity and inclusion.
Thank you so much. Colin, always good to welcome you. It's been a while. I was looking forward to having you on a panel.
That is very kind of you. It's good to see you. It's good to be with all of you. Sundari, that is incredible commitment. So thanks for what you're doing. I was just complaining to someone how long my day was, and then I heard that you were joining us at 3 a.m. and it completely changed my perspective. So I'm Colin Mincy. My pronouns are he and him. I am the co-founder of a DEI and work engagement consultancy called Beyond the Work LLC. But I have been an HR practitioner for more years than I'd like to publicly admit. And I think, so I'm actually not a data expert, but I am a data evangelist. And the difference is there are people on this panel who can very intelligently and deeply go into data, but I'm actually here as an HR leader who leverages and realizes that data is at the center of all processes and initiatives and decisions. And I'm also a student of history, and there's a famous statistician, W. Edwards Demmer, who said, you know, in God we trust, and then all others rely on data. And I have been in the workforce since the 90s, and we've been talking about DEI the entire time. And the reason we haven't moved the needle is because we've had the emphasis on the wrong syllable, and because we haven't properly incorporated data to not only drive our strategies around DEI, but also to hold ourselves accountable. So that's why I'm here, and I'm really excited to be with this excellent group of practitioners, and I'm particularly excited to see you again, Manola. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Brian, I mean, who else could have made this panel so much perfect? It's so good to see you again. Welcome.
Likewise. Thank you so much. Very excited to be here. Brian Fitzpatrick. I founded and run my own consulting firm, Stediema Consulting. I'm the guy that came from the quote unquote business side of the house, strategic planning and operational improvement type roles, and then really entered HR through what in hindsight was a gift, creating a DE&I function. And my consulting focuses on people analytics and DE&I along with change management. So this topic and the intersection, right, of analytics and DE&I is a passion play for me. And why by design? Really looking forward to the conversation. In my opinion here, briefly, a lot of companies have they've had the right intentions of creating and running DE&I programs. I think as regards data, either they're measuring the wrong things often, or keyword that Colin just used, accountability. there isn't any, and so the data is there in plain sight, and no one's calling it out. So thank you so much for hosting me in this great panel. Look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. And Brian, I will need a little bit of extra logistics help from you. You have an amazing mic. It's a high fidelity mic that makes all of us, super envious, but it picks up on everything. So may I just kindly ask you, when you're not speaking, to stay on mute? That would be wonderful. Thank you so much. Now, where do I start? I knew this conversation would be wonderful. I knew this conversation would be frustratingly short. So let me refocus. One question that went through all our conversations so far in this summit was, how do we make sure that we do not get overwhelmed by data and by all the available people analytics out there? So before we dive very, very deep into, what are data-informed approaches, what do inclusive workplaces look like, how do we make sure that we make intentional, educated, meaningful decisions about the data and analytics that we use? And for some strange reason that I have no data to explain, I always go diagonally with my first question. So Alex, that will make you our pioneer on this one.
But lucky me, right? Okay, so the question was, how do you not get overwhelmed with the data? Right. Yeah. So, I think back to, starting the DEI function in my last company was not my first time starting an HR function. And I think what I think about most is what seems to be on the minds of as much of the audience as I've been able to kind of interact with coming into it. And what is going to have the most impact on the employee experience? It's interesting because, and I'm sure you've all experienced this, when you start the DEI function, often employees are sitting there waiting for a training rollout, thinking that magically, unconscious bias training is just going to be the savior that everybody needs, right? So, kind of taking a step back and figuring out what are the greatest needs of the organization. Maybe you have the diversity, but all your diversity is at the lowest levels, right? So you need to dig into your equity analytics. Maybe you're getting a lot of people who feel like, if you have a question on the engagement survey around belonging, feel that they don't feel a sense of belonging. And that obviously can go in all dimensions of diversity. But I think, looking at what is the data you already have, talking to the people and getting a pulse, get some from leadership, but get as much as you can from the employees themselves. That could be tapping into employee resource groups. It could be looking at the engagement survey, also kind of planning out the timeline of things, right? If performance management is not coming up till, several months from now, maybe your priority is actually, doing a career development program based upon kind of what the answers are that people mentioned related to career development. So I think those things combined, I know that's not a clear-cut answer, but I do think it's so case by case, and it depends on your culture. It depends on what people are saying, that I think makes a huge influence on it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And now the unmuting competition is officially open. So let's see who has been practicing since the last panel. Colin.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say, for those of you who watched the last session, Stephanie talked about, starting with purpose and outcomes and being purpose driven and outcome driven. And I think, I've never been good in math, but the whole part of being able to get to the right answer is that you've got the factors in place. And so, similar to what Alex just talked about, I think that there are a lot of masters that that you want to please in this process. You want to really understand where staff sentiment is. I think you want to understand what the trends are in your industry or space, so that you are solving for the right things. And then I think you want to leverage best practice. But like anything, I think you have to start out by identifying, I call it naming and claiming, the spaces that you are doing well in, right? And not stopping there, but continuing to sustain and build on that. You're naming and claiming the spaces that you know you're behind in, right? And leaders sometimes want to pretend they don't understand what those dynamics are, but I think that they do. And I think it's important to dialogue those, record those, and document those. And then you want to go beyond what's in your own experience or what's in your own atmosphere, and really look at what the trends are around you in your industry. What is best practice? And when you marry those things together, I think you have the foundation of a sustainable and comprehensive DEI strategy. And then you can start to parlay the things that you want to measure, not for the sake of checking boxes and saying that you're measuring it, but because you want to really pinpoint the spaces that you want to get better. Of course, I would shout this if I could, but I want to be respectful. You're connecting that to a communication strategy so that you are not only internally but publicly talking about the things that you're working towards, the behaviors you're trying to correct, the programming and awareness you're trying to create, and on a quarterly basis, you're reporting on your progress, and on a monthly basis, you're communicating all of the things that you're doing, and all of the ways that people can participate in those processes.
Barry. Oh,
yeah, go on,
okay.
go on.
No, Sandra, I know you were ahead of me, so why don't you go ahead, and then I'm happy to share my thoughts.
No, just building on, I mean, totally connects on the, especially on the name and claim, Colin. That's a nice way of remembering what to do. I think one is a laser focus on what you want to achieve. Like there is mountains of data and all that. So I think I was listening to this podcast which talked about the sailing competition, America's Cup, where a coach was brought in, and the coach said everything that the coach was working on was towards, will this make the boat go faster? Any suggestion, anything was around that. So literally, even for diversity, looking at that laser sharp focus on getting things going, that one thing that you want to move, not those 100 things which are nice to have kind of thing. The second thing is about, communication, obviously, is connecting thing. One is, how do you present it in a way which is simple and comparable? And I remember the US Department of Agriculture, I think around 2011, moved away from representing, when they were trying to look at work on healthy eating guidelines, moved away from representing everything as a food pyramid to moving it to a food plate. Nobody eats out of a pyramid. People eat out of a plate. So really presenting data in that kind of a communicatable fashion. And I think the third thing is really listening on the ground. We might say that we have all this going, but the reality may be quite different. And I'm remembering Betsy Holden, who used to be the VP of marketing at Kraft Food. She was due for a promotion. She was pitching a hat in, and she was pregnant with a second kid. And she goes to her boss and she says, what do you think? What are my chances? Should I put my hat in, kind of thing? And he says, white male boss, as it happens to be, says, Betsy, we've never had anybody with 2 kids take on this role. Now, there are 100 ways for Betsy to react at that point of time. She just turned around to him and she asked him, how many kids do you have? And 2, he said. So really picking up on those specifics, date, and sharing those examples, bringing it back to communication. I would say these 3 good way to filter.
Thank you. Barry.
Thank you. +1 to all of this, and I think one of the ways that you can get really clear and honed in on what analyses you prioritize focusing in on is being crystal clear on your definitions in that work. In my work, my team's work at Stitch Fix, we are really crystal clear on what equity means, which is outcomes that disproportionately advantage groups who have been historically dominant in our culture, right? For race and ethnicity, that's white people. For gender, that's men, just as two examples. And so I've worked with teams historically on the people analytics side who get really curious about comparing outcomes for every group against every other group. That is not equity. Equity is about comparisons to the dominance group. And so one of the ways that we've been able to simplify the work that we're doing is by being crystal clear on what outcomes we are trying to drive and for who, and focusing on those outcomes consistently. Because we don't want to end up in a situation where we, for example, and this is common, especially in the last couple of years, drive a wedge between Asian and Black employees in the company because their outcomes are different. That is not the equity that we are working toward, right? We're working toward elevating all of our experiences, and that has an impact on what analyses you run, and especially to Colin's point and Sundari's too, what you present out to the company. You're influencing the actions that people are taking, the priorities that we hope they are working with us to drive, and that starts with being really clear on what you are going after.
Brian.
Yeah, I can jump in for sure on this one. Look, I'll pick up on something that Barry just said. It was a great call out, operational definitions. So Barry, you were talking about equity. How many times do companies say they want to focus now on diversity or inclusion, right? So this is the topic of this talk. And someone already called it out. It's kind of become memeable. Doing the unconscious bias training, right? It's like the so-called playbook. The other one is to focus immediately on talent acquisition and start looking to hire Black and Latino and all the different categories. And that's great. That's diversity. That's not inclusion. So that level of sloppiness can't be allowed. And I think if you're in this discussion and heading up the efforts, you have to be the steward and keep people honest.
I love this conversation, and it made me remember another panel, another Hacking HR panel, and it was a DEIB panel. And one of the speakers said that there are so many conversations about inclusive workplaces that are still being driven by diversity data and diversity analytics. So I would really be curious to hear, when we talk about data and we talk about analytics, what are those metrics? What are those data points that really drive a conversation about inclusive workforce, and not ways of having diverse headcounts of some sort, of some slice? And Colin, I would invite you to lead us into this.
Well, I'm glad you said that, only because to pick up on Brian just said something really, really important, which is, and Barry touched on it also, it's really dangerous to focus on talent acquisition as a mechanism to get stronger on DEI without like tilling the land and making sure that there's actually a foundation in place that will allow people who've been historically excluded to feel safe, to be set up for success, long-term sustainable success, right? Not just hired and leave after 1 year, and to feel like they belong to something, and God forbid, enter a workplace where they see people who look like them and have experiences like them and come from cultures like them. So please, please continue to have strategies to hire diverse talent, but recognize that the responsibility, that's just the beginning. And if that hire isn't mobilized and advancing throughout the organization, then you actually haven't really done anything, but hired someone who feels isolated or continues to feel marginalized. So I'll stop preaching and answer your question, but please, let's do better on that. Look, I actually, I think that there's a deep intersection between employee engagement and DEI, right? That we should continue to talk about, right? Because what we really want to understand is, to what extent do I feel like my issues, my concerns, my challenges, my past, my desires, the things that I need from work, because we all need different things for work. To what extent does leadership and HR policies and our DEI programs, to what extent are those things informed by those perspectives, right? And that's the key to really solving these issues. And the danger of not doing that is what Chris Rock would call rubbing Robitussin on a broken limb, right? It's a response. You're doing something, but you're actually not healing anything. So I would encourage folks to look at the extent to which people feel included, people feel engaged, and people feel like they're part of something that the organization is trying to solve for, so that not only they have better experiences, but they can talk about their positive experiences and bring into the organization other people from that background or other backgrounds, because they said, this is a safe place to work, and this is a place where I can bring my full self to work.
I'd love to build on that. So, something Colin was saying is that, look, like, we can bring the diversity in, but if there's not an inclusive and equitable space, not only will they leave, but it could cause irreparable damage to our reputation when it comes to, getting greater diversity long term. So it's so important that before you kind of dive right into the recruiting metrics, you're actually looking at inclusion and equity. You can be doing some of the recruiting efforts during that time, but you really need to focus on that inclusion and equity. So for instance, I mentioned employee engagement survey. So I would actually, my admin access would include a breakdown by demographic of engagement scores, right? So, and not just the answers to the questions on the DEIB questions, right? It would be the full engagement score. So I could really analyze what is going on here and then take it a step further, right? Because the numbers will tell you something, but they don't tell you the full picture, right? And you can go through some of the open-ended comments, but I strongly encourage everyone to do focus groups, interviews, whatever you can do, whatever is within your scope to really dig into those, right? So that's something you can do. And just to give you a more tangible example, so in an organization I worked at, I was hearing anecdotally that the Black employees specifically, people of color overall, but Black employees specifically, were feeling like they were just instantly put on a PIP no matter what mistakes they made, right? And feeling like other people who didn't look like them were not, right? So, I had all these anecdotes in mind. So I worked with the people operations team to say, what's going on here? So we looked into the themes of why people are put on a performance improvement plan in the first place. We looked at the whole picture, not just of Black employees, but all employees, right? And we looked at, and we realized that they were distributed inequitably, that Black employees were put on a PIP at a much greater rate than any other demographic, but especially versus, the white employees. So what we did was we looked at, why are these Black employees being put on PIP? And we realized what is the top theme, and I think probably all of you are going to guess this in your head right now: communication. They often felt like, they didn't form that trust and that connection with the employee at the end of the day, right? So the manager often kind of didn't understand where they were coming from. They misunderstood their communication style. I am someone who is an incredibly direct person myself, and I know I don't always translate well. And then I know if I was a Black woman, I would absolutely be put on a PIP likely for some of my conversations. So what we did was I worked with them to actually look at the system and figure out what are some things we can add to the process to make it not so easy to just throw someone on a PIP. Right? I was very honest with the managers. I was like, my job right now is to make your job a little bit harder. But at the end of the day, what I can promise you is you're going to be better managers. And through coaching, through adding steps in the process, I was actually put into the process for every single PIP, not just for people of color, but anyone in the organization, because it's really good for me to have a holistic picture. And we were able to make a dramatic difference just in a quarter. So you can't, there are those levers you can pull that can make a big difference. And that's just one example just to kind of make it a little bit more tangible.
I also just want to be mindful for 1 second and tell our audience that PIP stands for Personal Improvement Plan, just decodifying acronyms. Thank you so much. Barry, I saw you take a breath to speak, please.
Alex, so much love for all of the work that you just did and described there. That is why we are in this work, right? One sort of, I guess, like analytical aside to further reinforce what we're talking about here, and to maybe challenge some of the industry best practices around how to do analytics work well in a company, is the topic of statistical significance. In a DEI context, we have to be very mindful of the fact that small population sizes mean nothing in terms of whether that group should be disregarded or not analyzed or not taken a closer look at. In our definition of equity, in the work that I do, in the work that I've led at internal companies and in consulting earlier in my career, I've had to push my team and my colleagues to remember that we're talking about whole human beings. If your team only has 3 Indigenous people, those 3 Indigenous people should be held dearly. You should be talking with them regularly. You should be keeping in mind their outcomes. And yes, there are some caveats to understanding the outcomes of that group, and also rates analyses account for differences in demographics in and of themselves. You don't need to bring on an additional barrier of statistical power to understand whether those results are practically meaningful. They are practically meaningful. So we have to keep in mind how we're approaching that. I think this goes back to your earlier question too, Manila, of how we think about prioritizing and simplifying when we don't have a lot of work. You don't have to have the most advanced analytics capabilities to understand when there are differences in employee experiences by demographic, and to Alex's point, take action based on what you find.
I mean, so much to pick on. One definitely on, Colin, you mentioned about linking employee engagement and D&I part of it. And I think that's really key to what leaders need to do in today's world. And I live in Asia, I live in Hong Kong, pretty much a lot of the command and control kind of leadership still in some places. So how can leaders shift from that and move on to being connectors? And I think Frances Frey, who's with the Harvard Business School, she in a book Unleashed talked about leaders actually going around and making a list of indignities that the employees are facing and looking to convert as many from the indignities list to a dignities list. And that would really touch a lot of lives. So leaders have that kind of a role to play, not just, not broad brush, not top down, not anything, but really being that connectors. And I know we're talking about, type of organizations and where they've been. Again, very local organizations to what international organizations do in terms of D&I policy. That's something definitely. I remember one of the large organizations, multinational organizations, they decided to introduce flexi work long before it became a buzzword now. And when they did it in UK, everybody was happy. I don't need to commute into London. Great. I'll stay at the suburbs and I can work from there. Fantastic. They took the same thing and said, hey, everybody, all of you can be flexi working in Japan. In Japan, with the house sizes being what they are, people said, no, I can't. I want everything neat and organized on my table. I can't put my router. I can't put the Wi-Fi thing. I can't put my laptop, and everything looks so messy and ugly. Not going to work for me. They took the same thing and said, hey, flexi hours in Pakistan. And the women employees there said, no way. My mother-in-law and my father-in-law are expecting me to be making tea for them if I sit at home. I want to run to an office. I don't want flexi. I don't want work from home. I want an office space. So you really can't take one policy from one place and transplant it to another. How are you really keeping your ear on the ground and making those regional, local, national, and individual tweaks? Not all parents are the same. Not all people are the same. I mean, everybody needs a tweak. And that's really the role of the leader, to do that, have a huge listening Mickey Mouse ear on all the time.
Brian.
Yeah. So look, if we're talking about differentiating diversity from inclusion, employee engagement is a great place to start. I'll give you another example, which is compare the demographics, and the assumption is that you have that at some level, ideally by race and gender and sexual orientation and all the many other categories. But compare that for your employees with that of your leadership specifically, or your client base, or the larger community. Most of us, unfortunately, see a contrast of pyramids, where the large part of your employee base, especially if it's dispersed across a number of functions, will have very strong representation among Black and Latino and APAC employees, as an example. But then when you look for a similar proportion at the leadership level, what you find, in fact, is the inverse. And so this is a classic example of, you don't have a diversity problem, you have an inclusion problem. And so where can I focus my efforts in order to change policies and procedures to give those employees that are overrepresented, in fact, allow them to take a shorter path to get to the top?
The next question comes as a bit of a challenge, and we are well into the second half of our conversation. So I already made up my mind about 20 minutes ago that this exact panel needs to be signed up for an entire series. So I will be sending an email to this and to Enrique. Now, let's imagine, and I'm sure we don't have to stretch our imagination too much, that there is a meeting at work, and a leader says the following: we really need to build a data-informed approach to our, inclusive workforce. As someone who knows that part of the accountability and the responsibility to build that data-informed approach will fall on us, how would you take this conversation further? And I am also curious whether you would have two different conversations if this request comes from an HR leader in comparison to a business leader. And I will just give you a few seconds to think about and to get into your improv personas. And I will welcome everybody who joined us a little bit later and Also, those of you who need to jump off a little bit before we do wrap up the second day, please know you won't be missing out on anything, because the recordings will be waiting for you on hackinghrlab.io or on our LinkedIn space. So advertisement break is over. And Barry, would you be okay leading us into this scenario play a little bit?
Sure. I'm not going to completely act. I'm just going to say how I would respond, though I appreciate the invitation to creativity. I think to answer the second question first, if this question came to me from an HR leader and not a business leader, my question will be, how are we going to bring the executive team into the loop here? The analytics story, the narratives, the accountability conversations I would want to have require us to have a broader conversation with the executive team. And the analyses themselves wouldn't differ. The sort of idea of a data-informed approach for me is consistent regardless of who I'm speaking with. The accountability changes though, right? Holding executives accountable for the outcomes that we're working toward and the actions that they're taking in support of that outcome, that lives at the executive level at companies. There's for sure work that every single level of leaders need to be doing. And I'm so sorry if you can hear that. My dog wants to contribute to this conversation.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful. You're being supported and cheered on. We will take all the encouragement we can get, especially on this topic.
Listen, every leader at Stitch Fix who I work with knows Lola. She is one of our coworkers. I'm so sorry.
Now my dog is barking.
Yeah.
You see, we do have a parallel conversation going on. We are all forms of life inclusive on Hacking HR panels.
Yeah. But I think, the TLDR is, yes, let's definitely take a data-informed approach to this work. Here is what that means in the way we lead DEI here at this company. Here's what it means for us to keep equity at the center, which is a value of our organization, right? And so I think you got the point. I think I'm just gonna go take a her.
Thank you. Say hello to Lola for us. Okay, who wants to contribute? Colin, is your dog still barking as well, or?
No, but I'm gonna be, because I've been well behaved the whole session, so I'm gonna take the liberty to do what I usually do and be slightly rebellious and say that the HR and the DEI leaders should be on the executive team. And then we can have one conversation about where we want to go and what we need to measure, right? And so that's the first point I want to make. And I think, you asked a previous question about the complexity of data, and I, every journey starts with a single step, right? And so if folks who are tuned in, and thank you for doing that, are doing this for the first time or in environments where leadership does not understand the importance of these things, and there needs to be influencing and evangelizing to get them there, start somewhere, start small and leverage, your traditional HR data sets like turnover and identity demographics and how you track demographics through mobilizations and promotions and all these other things, and just start there until you do the work of naming and claiming where those gaps are, and then you add the gaps as you go along, and before long you've got a menu of things to really measure. So you can keep it simple and not too scary, and really start there. I think the point is just start, just begin. And then the last thing I'll say is it doesn't matter how people feel about the results. What matters is what we do with the results, right? The fact that we transparently message what the results are without reframing, repackaging, and adulterating what we want it to say. And we have action planning that is directly connected to that transparent feedback. But please, like, elevate your HR and DEI leaders. Thank you.
It's interesting to me. Like, I feel like if I heard that from an executive, they probably just attended a conference where everyone told them, you need a data-driven approach, and they don't actually know what it means. They just want to be able to say it because they heard it from one of their peers. So that's, I think step number one, don't be intimidated if they come to you. Like, don't think it's an accusation that you're not being data-driven in the first place. Actually take it as an opportunity to educate them on what a data-driven strategy looks like. So I think that's number one. The more I've coached executives, the more I've realized that they don't know just as much as a whole lot of people, right? But they're expected to know, so they don't feel comfortable necessarily saying that, and so they kind of go with what they've heard as the best practice. So yeah, and I would absolutely amplify what Colin said around having HR and DEI. I was actually thrown off when you said you heard that from an HR leader, because I was like, well, the DEI leader and the HR leader would at least be on the same level. So why would I hear that from an HR? So I actually had to think differently. But I understand if you're not in that position, right? And that doesn't mean you didn't advocate enough. There's a lot of things that go into that. So I think it would be the same advice for an HR leader, right? What does that mean to you? How does that fit into the broader people strategy? How does everything fit into the broader business strategy? If we're trying to increase sales by X amount, let's talk about the data related to that, right? Let's talk about how having greater diversity, having greater inclusion, equity can actually impact the bottom line, and really kind of making sure that all the goals are in alignment with each other. I think the other big thing is using it as an opportunity to clarify exactly what you need. If they want to have this big data-driven approach, perfect example is if you use Workday, for instance. Workday requires people who do reporting full-time. So you're going to need dedicated resources, right? I mean, you should ask for that anyway, but this is a great kind of avenue in to be asking for those things. I would say, hopefully you've already started having conversations with IT, with HR, with marketing, with all of these different groups. So you've already built up the relationship where it does become a bit easier. So they're not so kind of, stingy with their data, right? They feel comfortable sharing everything with you. Ideally, obviously, you already have access to everything. That's another avenue in to say, well, I don't have access to, these particular statistics, so I can't do a data-informed approach for this particular initiative because I don't have that access, right? This also opens up that conversation. So I think it's the relationship building. It's defining, clarifying, and then using that opportunity to advocate for what you need for that data-driven strategy.
I'll call out 2 points based on the conversation thus far. First, huge red flag if HR is coming to you and looking to own this, cut off from the business, right? So DE&I is part of the business strategy. That is a surefire way of having the idea and the program die on the vine if it's seen as an HR pet project somehow and not connected, as Alex was just saying, to the overall business strategy and goals. That's first. And then second, as Barry had said right at the top, yes, you do immediately have to go to senior leadership to ensure their buy-in. And specifically, you have to get an executive sponsor. One person, one neck to get your hands around, so to speak. You need one accountable person, ideally the CEO, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It could be someone senior who is influential. But as you progress, invariably, you're going to hit roadblocks, both senior people or managers that are not on board for whatever their reasons are for DE&I, or perhaps even worse, they're indifferent and they say the right things, but then they don't actually follow up and help you progress. And so there's sometimes you have to pull that card and get the senior person in to kick butt and ensure that you have some backup. So this is not being done sort of undercover. This has got to be under spotlight and ensure that everyone is aware that this is a company prerogative.
I was very tempted to ask you about your biggest learning or your biggest takeaway from doing this work, but then I was like, no, let's do something different. So I will ask you the same thing that I asked the previous panel, which is, what is the most meaningful thing about data and data-informed approaches to inclusive workplaces that you had to unlearn and relearn as you went through your work in this field? And I will leave that question there, and we will do this popcorn style. Wherever inspiration comes, then please.
I was actually looking at, what is a data-driven approach, and really all the points on CEO sponsorship, everything together, and also taking that tag from you, Minola, for that little bit of creative part of it. So I was going to ask, how many people have watched the movie Cars from our panel? Few hands up, yeah, right. So what percentage of male talking characters were there in the movie? Any guesses on the percentage? It was 90%. And only 10% was female, which was car number 3. So the Annenberg Inclusion Initiative, which is a think tank which studies D&I in entertainment space specifically, they did this research and found out that 17% of the 120 recent animated movies, only 17% featured female characters as even a co-lead or lead. So Jessica Haid, who was part of Pixar, took upon herself to go on and do this research and did this study for the entire all Pixar animation movies. And it was stark. In Toy Story, there was only one mother character. There was a sister character. Bo Peep was there. And why is this a problem? Because we are living in a world of imagination. And as humans, we are looking at projecting ourselves in the characters that we see. But so we can imagine that cars can talk, but we will only visualize it as Chris Owens being the walking, talking car. And so it's really important. Jessica's work on dissecting the data and taking it forward was a penny drop moment for Pixar to lead diversity among the characters in the animated films. So she handed out charts and graphs, took out the emotion and presented it to the executives, so the evidence was right there. And they put a plan in place to change that, which is how you get all these new movies, which are Coco, Toy Story 4, which all has a lot more of those characters built in. And every time she hit a roadblock with the data, the CTO, and this is where the sponsorship and all the additional help from everybody comes in, Josh Miner, he came in and said, oh, don't worry, we'll find a tool to track this data. We'll get you this data. We'll ensure it's done. So really looking at all hands in, you have the data, it's shared in context, there's a clear narrative, and it moved the entire organization towards inclusive action. So I'll just leave that as that encompassing example there.
Thank you, Sundari.
Wow. Oh, sorry, Colin. Do you want to go first?
Okay. Not after that analysis, no.
Yeah. Don't worry about that. I'm going to pivot us just a little bit too, because I don't have just really lovely Pixar animation examples. I love that though. I know, Minola, at the start of this time, you asked us if, and the audience here, if they have resources, books, other things that they think are really important for folks to understand and consume if they'd like. One that I'll shout out is Michelle Mi-Jung Kim's book, The Wake Up, which I think reflects a lot of really paradigm shifting ways of thinking about DEI work and who we center in this work. I am trained as an industrial organizational psychologist. So when I was in grad school and early in my career working in consulting, everything was about the data that we were working with and not the people who we were working to serve. And so for a long time early in my career, I spent so much of my time disproportionately focusing in on the numerical, I guess, quote unquote, more objective side of this work. And Michelle and other thought leaders in this space, including my own leaders at Stitch Fix, have helped me see that not only are conversations with people data, but this is really what we're talking about. We're talking about the people, and their emotions matter. Emotions at work are also data and are relevant to the real performance outcomes and retention outcomes of our employees, right? And so it took me, I think, longer than it needed to for me to understand that, even as someone with multiple marginalized identities myself, I should be allowed to think about and talk about emotions and share those at work and help understand and funnel the experiences of our employees in that same way that Alex spoke to a little bit earlier. And even, I can say personally, I run our engagement surveys with my team at Stitch Fix, and we had conversations fairly recently with a group of employees from a marginalized racial group who have different experiences of belonging from their white employees. And just being in virtual rooms with those employees, it was hands down the most engaging experience that I've had this year doing this work with my team. And it just reminded me, and my leader reminded me too, that we should be doing stuff like this a lot more regularly, because this is what the work is about.
Thank you. I just want to be mindful of time, and I want to check with Brian, Colin, and Alex. Are you okay if we overrun a couple of minutes? Yeah? Okay, perfect. So, Colin, I saw you unmuted.
Yeah, so I'm approaching your question a little differently as well. But I'm approaching it from the vein that we talked a little bit about leadership before, but we did not talk about the fact that sometimes leadership is a barrier to achieving all of the things that we're talking about. But maybe we can do that on part 2, because this is actually, I think, my 10th or 11th Hacking HR panel, but by far my favorite. So apologies to the predecessors. So I'm approaching the answer to the question about the barriers that we usually face. How much does this cost? Well, the answer is the data. We already have the data, right? We have exit interviews, right? We go through this exhaustive process of asking people why they leave and getting those learning lessons, but we don't ever do anything with it. And a lot of times the responses to the questions in exit interviews intersect very closely with the extent in which people feel respected and valued at work, and the extent in which they feel like they belong to the culture. So there's data already at our fingertips that we can leverage. I'm not suggesting that we don't, go beyond that and go deeper among that, but look at the data you have and make sure that you're doing something useful with it, and that it's baked into and weaved into the DEI journey. The second is, I can't believe, after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the rollback of women's rights, we're seeing, not just in the US, around the world. And I can't believe I have to say this, but we're still dealing with leaders who want to understand the business case of investing in these things. And as offensive as it is, not only, as an HR and DI leader, but as a person of color, tell those executives who don't know better to ask that question that 20% of the organizations that actually have a data set and accountability measures and an internal communication strategy that's connected to DEI have a 20% more likelihood of being successful. And that success is actually defined by employees feeling like the organization authentically cares about them. And it's reflected not only in engagement surveys, but it's reflected in the extent in which people show up for ERG programs, and the extent in which people talk about the company culture and are on LinkedIn sharing their experiences. So it's not always about starting from the beginning. Doesn't mean you're starting from scratch. It just means that you're identifying that there's work to be done and you're starting the work. But there's already a foundation that you don't realize that's already at your fingertips, and leverage those things in your business case to deliver the results that you need, right? Getting to a higher level of leadership, which is where HR and DEI belong, getting resources and capacity to actually do the work in a meaningful way, having the right platforms and data sets that are the foundation of the data infrastructure that you're trying to build. So I'm saying all of this to say that it's hard work, but it's important and meaningful work, and it takes time. And once again, all you have to do is just begin.
Thank you so much. Let's see. Alex?
Sure. I've just had so many thoughts coming to my head. I've been trying to kind of organize them as everyone is speaking, and some different thoughts came to mind. One, we haven't touched on the global piece. Foundry had kind of pinged me on the side to mention kind of how do we tweak our strategy. And actually, Barry bringing up the IO psychology thing actually reminded me of this. So I teach a course on managing change in global HR management. And all of my students are all grad students in IO psychology. So I'm giving them a lot of the kind of cultural awareness. We're having a lot of these conversations on top of the fact that I was global leader. So we had, at my last company, we had, EMEA offices. So EMEA stands for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, but really Northern Africa. And then APAC, Asia Pacific, right? So we had people all around. And while I think we all know that racism, homophobia, ableism, all of these things are global, they look very different. And the conversations you have to be very different. And the data looks different. Perfect example, when you're collecting demographics. So first of all, you have to find out if they even, how they translate. There's a lot of data you can't combine. And then how do you have the conversation? Because if you really want to bring people in, you have to make sure that you are thinking through the cultural lens. And even when you think about translations, right? There's languages where inclusion translates to assimilation. That is not what we want, okay? Inclusion or belonging, right? Belonging can sometimes translate to assimilation as well. So we want to make sure that we're very clear on the things that we're saying. And yeah, to that kind of IO psych side of things, don't get so obsessed with these numbers that you forget that kind of, human side of it and really hearing the stories to have the full picture. And I think the final thing is, again, you had asked about resources. I'm thinking about change management. So I'm certified in change management. You don't need a certification. It's just, that was kind of a good foundation for me. But there's so many resources out there because what you do with the data, that's what you think about afterwards, right? And change management is such a huge part of that. So, you can look up resources like ProSci, PROSCI, Association of Change Management Professionals. There's a really amazing book called Switch by the Heath brothers that really just give great guidance for moving people along the change path. So I know that didn't directly answer your question, but those are just kind of some thoughts that were floating around in conclusion.
Thank you so very much. And Brian, you are our hot seat of going last champion today.
How illustrious. I think your original question was around something that we had to unlearn. So my response to that question is, for the audience, never assume that a well-designed report or dashboard with metrics and a clear call to action that if that gets distributed and presented to the head of a business, that they're actually going to act on it. The follow-up is the key, and the point earlier about having executive sponsorship to help ensure accountability. I've seen situations where really great and compelling data, it was there, it was in plain view of everyone. The failure, though, was around the business acting upon it, and sometimes it's pulling teeth because it goes against their current set of initiatives, and other times it's too difficult, and the manager is indifferent. But I know we've been talking about that data is important, which it is obviously, but it has to be within the broader context, and there always has to be a follow-up. So you don't just do your work and hand the platter over. You're always circling back, and it's that herding cats perspective that I mean, not just in DE&I work, but in so much of what we do in business.
Thank you all so very much. So grateful for having you all here. So incredibly extra grateful for having a little bit of more extra time with you. Less than 1 minute, the wrap-up question. If you think back to all the conversations around inclusive workplaces, how do those make you feel in one word? And what we will do, we will go Brian first and then all the way back to Sundari. We do it a little bit differently this time. And Brian.
So just to make sure that I'm clear, one word to describe what my experience has been about approaches to people analytics and inclusion.
If you think back to all the conversations around data-informed approaches that you're part of, how do those make you feel?
Underwhelmed.
Thank you. Colin.
Validated.
Alex.
Energized.
Barry.
Centered.
And Sundari.
Hopeful.
Thank you. I am deeply, deeply grateful. Sundari, Barry, Alex, Colin, and Brian. It was a gift. Thank you, everybody, for staying with us, whether just for this conversation or throughout the summit. And please do keep in touch, keep the conversation going, and visit us as many times as you want to get a bit of insight and inspiration and just wonderful energy from amazing people. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Barbara.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye all.
Bye. Thank you so much.